I think in some ways, I mean, it's like I'm very um I'm a skeptic. There's the whole idea of a nonfiction novel, right? That was sort of a thing in the 60s with the kind of new journalists and, the sort of Norman Mailer model, Truman Capote model in Cold Blood. Um, I have mixed feelings about the idea of the nonfiction novel, but I think that in some ways it fits in this case. The Golden Hour is a book that on the one hand, tells the story of my own family, of my parents and of myself, and of our kind of respective 70-year odyssey through the motion picture industry. My dad was and still is a talent agent, and in 1956, I believe, he went to work for Lou Wasserman, who was then the head of MCA. Um, and my dad would do that, and then he went to work for William Morris in the 60s, and in the early 70s he was sort of part of the whole kind of new Hollywood scene. He was, represented, people like Bruce Dern and Beau Bridges, and then he wasn't one of the founders of CAA, but he was one of the people that went over to kind of build it in the late 70s. He was one of the earliest guys to go over, and that's where he kind of became a giant success. He still works there. And then I became a studio executive, production executive, and then studio executive in the 90s, and then a screenwriter. And of course, my mom was a screenwriter. But book is not just the story of my family. I realized while I was kind of thinking about the book that the story of my family is in many ways entwined with the much wider story of kind of not just the motion picture business, but in a lot of ways that, the whole American century. When my dad worked for Lou Wasserman, Wasserman was Ronald Reagan's agent and had helped kind of, you know, helped kind of architect Reagan becoming the head of the Screenwriters Guild, and then of course eventually becoming running for office and becoming governor. In the late 1960s, my mom was friends with people like Shirley Sutherland, who were sort of involved with the Black Panthers. Um, there's a kind of political narrative that unwinds alongside, when my dad was at CAA and his colleague and boss Michael Ovitz was busy kind of like brokering the sales of two different studios to Japanese corporations. It's like there's a there's a narrative that surrounds my family's narrative that the book also tells. And so the book is sort of, the intention of the book was to write this book that on the one hand could be very, very intimate, could be a kind of, a family story, a kind of emotional story in that regard, but that would also have this kind of, operatic, um, wider narrative that intersects with it and that is told at the same time. For the intimate stuff, it was just interviewing my surviving family members. In my mom's case, I had journals and I had her writings that she had left behind. Um, and then the rest was just, and the wider narrative, I was researching the way I'd research a novel. you know, um, a lot of works of Hollywood history. Some delving into some archives that are held at the Academy Museum and whatnot. Um, it was extremely difficult to kind of figure out how to get those proportions right. I think initially I sort of thought I'm going to write it like a kind of nonfiction cultural history and then kind of like weave the thread of my family into that. And it just wasn't working. And I ended up having to switch that around. I realized like, oh, I'm going to write it like a memoir and I'm going to weave the other stuff into it, in a kind of almost novelistic way. And that's how it came out. Lou Wasserman is pretty memorable. Huey Newton is pretty memorable. He's not in the book for that long, but he was someone that I spent a lot of time reading and writing around the Black Panthers. Um, Michael Ovitz, who I think is, someone that most people in Hollywood think they know, but I find him a kind of fascinating, slippery figure. James Baldwin is one. My teacher, and he certainly has some point of view um, stuff in the book. It's I don't think most people know just how um, he was at various times in his life involved in Hollywood. He did work as a screenwriter for hire, and he did actually have a kind of long history of being of writing about the movies as well and thinking about the movies. And I think he'd wanted to be a playwright at some point too. That was sort of on the table for him. There are a lot of other, there are a lot of kind of characters who, the writer Robert Benton, who co-wrote Bonnie and Clyde. There are other figures in the story who are less well known, but who also I think of as very important. A man named Raymond Bongiovanni. I had kind of periods of time. I had the book, I sold the book on proposal, so there was an outline. Not a super detailed outline, but I kind of had the book bricked out into like, well, the first section is going to deal with 1956 to 1963 when my parents meet. The next one's going to go from 63 to when my sister was born. Like I had kind of eras zoned out. And I didn't entirely know where I was going to end it. I certainly didn't know how I was going to end it. But I never do. There's always a kind of one of the weird things I've discovered, at least so far with each book, is that there comes a point a little past the halfway mark where I have a sense of like what the book's final word or image will be, but I have no idea how I'll get there, Um, but it's like somehow it's like I'm just pulling myself towards that finish line, such as it is. I'm not the world's most natural memoirist. It's in many ways I really find writing about other people far more revelatory than writing about myself is. So, but at the same time, I don't know. There was something that once I was in there was a kind of satisfyingly organic sense of like, oh, I'm with my dad now. Now I'm gonna go with now I'm gonna return to myself. Now I'm gonna go to my mom. Now I'm gonna kind of, bring in another storyline or come in from a third person character's point of view. There's something, those choices are become pretty instinctual for me. And they're very, it's very pleasurable. And I think it just comes from having to do with a kind of sense of some organic sense of, and then at the end, of course, there's always cutting, there's stuff where you kind of go, God, I go on for 40 pages here and I really love this character, but it's sort of hijacking. It's taking away from the main thread for too long. Um, um, but, um, it was those choices were, like I said, they seem to evolve pretty naturally from the kind of flow of the story I was trying to tell.